Whenever you are, let me know. All right. Hey, Derby Khan, how's everybody doing this morning? All right. Well, I want to welcome you to Mirai, Satori, OMG, Orari, IoT botnets, oh my. A little bit about me. I work on the threat intel team at NetScout, where I focus on IoT, Linux, and mobile malware. I'm a recovering pen tester. I've done everything from network pen testing to IoT software, hardware, and back-end service testing. Today's agenda, we're going to look at how Mirai has been used as a framework for IoT botnet authors. We'll take a look at 3 specific IoT variances. Those are Satori, OMG, Orari. We'll look at how each of them have used Mirai as a framework to build upon, and then also additional flair that they've added to make it their own. Next, we'll look at tricks and techniques you can use when analyzing IoT-based malware. We'll talk about some best practices around defending against IoT bots. And finally, we'll open it up to any questions you all may have. In August of 2016, the internet was hit with some high-profile, high-impact DDoS attacks. These DDoS attacks were associated with Mirai. Mirai targeted IoT devices. And some of you may be asking, what's an IoT device? Well, you can think of an IoT device as any system or any hardware that's running an embedded operating system that can send and receive data on the network. Common IoT devices that you'll see out there are IP-based cameras, cable DSL modems, and DVR systems. Mirai supported several architectures such as ARM, MIPS, x86, and PowerPC. The reason for this is because a lot of these IoT devices have these different chipsets. Not all of them are based on ARM, not all of them have MIPS or PowerPC on them. They're across the board. When Mirai came out, its attack vector was to use default credentials and scan for telnet. So what it'd do, it'd scan the internet, look for any devices that would have telnet available, and then use a set list of default credentials. These default credentials can be anything that were set from the factory time when the user received the device, or even credentials that were hard-coded by support organizations, such as maybe your DSL modem, your cable modem may have a backdoor password on there so they can get in there, update any firmware, that type of stuff. Now we fast forward to September of 2016. The author of Mirai decides to, hey, I'm going to open source or release my code. Pretty much talks about why he got into it, why he did it, and then released information on how to download the source, and also kind of made fun of people that were doing analysis on the bot itself. Once he open sourced it, or released it, or leaked it, however you want to look at it, we started seeing several variants come out based on Mirai. Here's the following graph of just the year-to-date of ingestion of different types of variances that were based on Mirai. We see several peaks and valleys here. These peaks and valleys are generally related to when a new variant comes out that adds additional functionality or adds additional attack vectors or implements some sort of new IoT vulnerability that has been released. Examples are like the GPON exploit or the Realtek SDK exploit. Now that we have a kind of a background of Mirai, let's take a look at 3 specific variances and how they've leveraged Mirai as a framework and then built upon it to add their own flair. The first one we'll take a look at is Satori, followed by OMG, and then we'll wrap it up with Orari. Satori. Satori emerged in late 2017. Since then, there have been several variances of Satori. Analyzing Satori, you can see it heavily used Mirai as a framework. Several functions map between the two, and we'll take a look at some of that. The original version used the default credential scanner just like Mirai, but other variances of Satori then started to implement other exploit techniques, such as remote command execution vulnerabilities, and some other ones which we'll dive a little bit deeper into. One cool thing about Satori was it's the first bot to support the Arch architecture. No other bot so far has come out to support that architecture. Now let's take a look at some of the code sharing that Satori uses from Mirai. This first example here, we see Mirai's table init function. This table init function, you can think of it as like a configuration table. In there, it stores information about like where the CNC domain is or where the CNC port is, and these values are stored. If you look at the strings, they're stored obfuscated, and we'll look at that obfuscation technique here in a minute. On the right-hand side here, we see Satori's, the sudo-C for Satori's configuration file. We see the same type of function where we're adding our table index, we add our obfuscated value, and then the size and length of that value. Now, I talked about how Satori and Mirai obfuscate their information. We can see that they both leverage the same function. The original Mirai source had this XOR function here, and if we look at the previous table, look at the previous table, we see that that was the key that was used when the source was released. That key is what's used to obfuscate each of those table settings. Satori did the same thing. It used the same function to obfuscate those strings, but used different keys. So you weren't seeing the same dead beef. They may have used different incantations of that, but same function, very easy to figure out what those encrypted or those XORed strings were. The reason for the XOR could have been a couple of things. One, to bypass maybe IDS, IPS types of situations, or to make it difficult for reversers or blue team members just to be able to run strings and figure out, oh, hey, here's a domain that it uses, here's a port it uses. In later variances, though, Satori swapped out its XOR function for a bit swap, which we see the pseudocode here. So it would swap the bits, and then it would call this base64 encode or decode function, and it would encode or decode the actual string itself. And here's the base64 encoder or decoder. And as you can see, I mean, nothing special. It's nothing revolutionary, just kind of reusing basic techniques. Mirai originally used a telnet, or a telnet scanner more or less, and then we'll look for default credentials. Satori did the same, but then it kind of upped its game by introducing IoT-based vulnerabilities, such as the Realtek SDK. Here's this assembly for a variant that was leveraging this exploit. And here we can see the exploit and the string being built for it. If we take a look at the payload itself, we can see what's actually going on. We see the exploit right here, followed by command injection, where it's using wget to download a copy of Satori and run it on device. Similar, Satori used the GPON exploit, same type of fashion. Here's a MIPS sample, and we can see the string being built. And if we look at the payload, we see the same type of signature here, where we're running our command injection and telling it to download a version of Satori and run it. The last example here of vulnerability or attack that Satori added is kind of one of my favorites. Around late August timeframe, middle of August, we saw a huge uptick in scanning for port 5555. And for those Android people out there, you know exactly what that port is. That's the ADB port. So Satori would sit there and scan the internet, look for any systems that had ADB open, and then would issue the following command to connect to ADB and issue a request to download a sample and run that sample to, again, infect the device and add it to its botnet. So we can see here through the evolution of Satori, the addition of new techniques to gain access and building upon Mirai. The next example I want to talk about is OMG. OMG was discovered in early 2018, another Mirai-based variant. What's cool about OMG is the authors decided to integrate a proxy server for both HTTP proxy and a SOX proxy into it, and similar to other variants, it used default credentials. If we simply run strings on the binary, we get a good indication of maybe what proxy it may run. And we can see here it's using 3proxy. Let's take a look at how OMG sets up this proxy. Here's a function that was inside OMG that actually gets the proxy portion set up. What it does is it first creates random ports for both the proxy, or HTTP proxy, and the SOX proxy. Then it goes through and we see this function called, which I cleverly named IP tables. And what this does is it either enables or disables IP tables on a device so that the botnet author can connect to it and proxy through it. Part of this function too would also send information on what ports those are to its CNC, so they know which one to connect to. And if we look at the IP tables function, we see how this is done. So it takes those random ports and generates a string based on that information. And how it does that is it stores the IP tables command in that similar table configuration file, similar to Mirai, and it pulls that value out and then substitutes it in the string and then returns that calls the command to either enable or disable it based on what the C2 has said. And if we go look at that configuration table, we see the same type of table settings where we have our values here, which are, again, obfuscated, and it uses that table to reference where that information is and pull it out. And we can see the actual IP table command right here, where this one specifically talks about dropping the table. So once it enabled these ports or disabled, once it enables a port, it needed to set up the proxy. We need to get those ports listening on the system and whatnot. Here's the function that handled it. When we look at the function, we can see how it calls the proxy command and with the variable, and that variable is the ports that we set up. Further down, we see additional configuration options such as the NS server, options to use. Oh, spilled. These server options to use along with the cache server and so forth. If we look at the configuration file on GitHub, we can see the exact same options here. So we can kind of get a good indication that the author just quickly copied this over just to get it up and running and get it out there. The last variant I want to look at is called Orari. Orari and Wicked were discovered in 2018. Both were based on Mirai. Orari is a funny story, and we'll get into it here in a minute. Orari originally used the default credentials similar to basic Mirai. Then it was updated to include additional command execution vulnerabilities. There's a variant called Wicked that was discovered, and part of Wicked's main purpose in life was to download copies of Orari. So it's a good indication that these two families were tied together. And Wicked targeted specific Netgear routers and CCTV DVRs. Similar to Mirai, Orari used the same type of CNC setup information. In the Mirai example here, we unlock the table to get the domain, and then we also unlock the table to get the port. The difference here is Orari decided to hardcode its IP address, which makes our life a lot easier when you just run straight into the IP address show up instead of having to figure out, okay, let's find the XOR. Well, not that difficult. It does save time if it's just hardcoded. But it still leverages the configuration table to pull the port number out. Not sure why they chose this setup versus just either hard coding both or just putting them in a configuration table. Who knows? Here's the function that looks for the default credentials. We can see the ones that were included in Orari. When it would go through and add these are the ones that would go through and see if they match. Once it found one that it matched, then it would move forth from there. So it used this until they got some love on Twitter. Here's a post that was put up pretty much making fun of or poking at the fact that Orari used, old school, old technique, telling that in response to this Twitter feed or this Twitter post, the authors introduced some vulnerability, this CVE, and attacked this to gain access. As I said, Wicked was also associated with Orari. Here's the different exploits that were used from Wicked, and we can see the similar pattern that we see going forward on all these variants, where they do the command injection and download a copy. Here's where it's downloading a copy for MIPS, and these are different exploits that were included. Some artifacts in here I blurred out just because of maybe some sensitive information or inappropriate information that was included here, but it's a kind of good indicator if you see that across multiple families at maybe one point of attrition between those families, that the author uses a certain style of labeling things or uses certain phrases or words. And the last one is kind of a funny thing. Reason for it, I really don't understand why they're doing it, maybe just to show off their elite ASCII art. But within the Mirai configuration table, they also contain certain strings letting the owner of the device know that it's been compromised. So we see, again, storing the information within the table, unobfuscating it, writing it out to the different portions of the file system, and then cool little ASCII art. we still see these attacks, and they're still going on. They're not going away. They're not slowing down. We'll still see variants using this. Here's just an example of a point of time at the beginning of August where we're seeing traffic. This is from our honeypot, collecting data of attacks that are being run in the wild. The purple here are variants or devices that are trying to scan for AD and exploit that. The other ones you can see down here, not as high frequency, but still there are the other exploits that we saw in some of the previous examples. And people still use Telnet. So now that we've talked about all these variances, how do we analyze them in a quick and efficient fashion? From a Blue Team's perspective, our goal is to figure out what new functionality they have, what new exploits they have, so we can kick out our IOCs. As part of the source that was released from Mirai, there's a build script to make your life easier. In the build script, there's the use of strip. And for those that are not familiar with strip, what it does is it removes any type of symbols into binary, which makes it difficult to reverse. And when I say symbols, it's stuff like what fork is and stuff like that, which makes you have to go through and figure out, okay, where are all these system calls to be able to trace it. So what you'll see is, you'll just see the basic assembly, you'll see a SVC 0 in the ARM world, and then you'll see the variable that's being passed to it to tell you what system call is. So you have to figure that out by yourself. But in some cases, the author gets lazy and just leaves full symbols there. So it's very easy to figure out which attacks are in use, what vulnerabilities it's going after, and whatnot. This, from a Blue Team's perspective or analyst's perspective, makes our life really easy. But what happens when you don't have that? You don't have these symbols, you get the strip binary. Why not use the source code the same way that a botnet author does? Why not leverage that to help us build signatures to be able to quickly analyze these variants to figure out what has changed? There's two tools I'm going to talk about real quick here is Deforia and Rizzo, which allows us to quickly analyze these samples. And if authors are here that wrote those, thank you. Deforia. You can think of Deforia as bin diff. And everybody get their screenshot? There you go. So how Deforia works is first you compile your unscripted Mirai variant. So in this case, like an ARM variant. You run Deforia, it creates an SQL database, which a bunch of heuristics that it uses to index information about what functions are there and kind of like signatures around those functions. Then what you can do is apply it to your strip binary. So here's a variant of Mirai where we see the default IDA labeling. This is a screen from Deforia. Deforia has different matches of confidence. Green means spot on. And we can see here, this is the table unlock function. And if we look at the source that it matches on, we look at the pseudo C for it, we can see, yep, that's our unobfuscation function. Rizzo. Rizzo's another favorite tool of mine. I love Rizzo. Rizzo builds like signatures that you can apply against the strip binaries. So similar fashion, you create your Mirai variant that's not, or you build your version of Mirai for the architecture you want to test with or analyze. Make sure you don't strip the symbols. Then you use Rizzo to create a pattern file or a signature file. Here's the strip binary. This is what we see. We see the functions over here that aren't labeled, just the default IDA labeling. We see the assembly. Nothing, no real good clues here. You know, a lot of work to try to figure out some just the basic functionality. Well, once we apply the Rizzo database, bam, we start seeing great information here. We can see what it shares with the Mirai variant, or what the Mirai variant shares with the variant that we built, or the code that we built off of. You see the function names labeled, which gives us a quick identification of, hey, this is what this function does, and allows us to kind of whittle down that noise that we see. With like any tool, it's not 100%. So you're not going to get 100% one-to-one matches all the time. Sometimes Rizzo or Deforia messes up and doesn't catch the right function. So a lot of times you just double check to make sure, but it does help reduce the noise. Another example of using Rizzo and Deforia, it's not just limited to Mirai. Recently there was a new bot that came out called Tori. This bot was built off of ulibc. So what we can do with the same type of kind of idea in mind, we can build a Rizzo file or a Deforia diff database based off of ulibc, and then apply that to the strip version of Tori to help us identify these common functions like memcopy or memalex. So we don't have to sit there and figure out, oh, well, we see this type of pattern here. Okay, this has to be memcopy. So Tori and Deforia does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. defending against IoT bots. Now, what can we do, to help reduce the risk of this? From the manufacturer side, we can start looking at doing code reviews, make sure secure code reviews and security assessments are being done against the devices during development time, not as an afterthought or a bolt-on. Not, okay, we have the chipsets, we have all this stuff. Now let's do the security review when we're kind of locked into using the technology and the hardware. From the user side, basic thing we can do is change the password right away. Let's not leave those default passwords admin, and let our devices be used as a bot. From an enterprise perspective, if we're using like DVRs or IP-based cameras, let's do ingress and egress filtering, simple things that we can prevent anybody on the internet from attacking. There's no reason that anybody on the internet should be able to access my DVR or my IP-based camera. And from the user's perspective also, we need to make sure that we're applying or subscribing to the manufacturer's security updates. And once we get that message coming in, we need to apply those patches and make sure that those devices are getting patched in a timely manner. So in summary, IoT devices are not going away, nor are malware targeting them. Just because of the simple fact of how many devices there are out there. It's a huge footprint and it's a very juicy target. Security around IoT is like that of late 90s on PCs. We see the same type of issues that we saw back then. We see default credentials, we see easy command injection, code execution, that type of stuff we still see. And from a blue team perspective, let's leverage the source. Botnet authors are doing it, why can't we? To help us reduce the time it takes to analyze these things and pull out these IOCs. And lastly, we should be thinking of IoT devices the same as our PCs and our servers. They should be added to our regular security testing, any type of network pen test or web app pen test. These devices should be thrown in there, along with our regular patching cycle. Most corporations have a regular date where they're doing their patches. They're patching their Microsoft systems, they're patching their applications. These IoT devices should be included along with that patching cycle. That's it. Well, thank you guys for coming. I'll open it up for any questions. Yes, sir.
Hey, I was just wondering if you noticed how crappy the code of Mirai is. I counted 3 buffer overflows in one screenshot, and it could be another way to mitigate it.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've thought about. Is actually attacking, not only that, since you have the source Mirai, you also have the CNC server. Reviewing the CNC server, see if there's any vulnerabilities there, and attacking the CNC server and taking it over and shutting it down that way. So there's a lot of these bots. I mean, the authors are not, I would say, the most security conscious coders. So yeah, there's a lot of bugs in them that we can leverage from a blue team perspective to, either use those to shut them down or whatnot. But that's one of those things you need to probably talk to your legal group. No problem. Anybody else? Any questions? All right, I'll be here for the rest of the con. Thank you, guys.